We can't find $150 billion. That's a lot of damn money. We don't know where it went. But somehow, the Israelis are able to find out that the fuel and the food and the medicine they send into Gaza is going to go to the people as opposed to the terrorists. It's impossible. And yet Andrea Mitchell, what are you going to do? You know, President Biden, he's getting quite annoyed by all this. Screw Biden. As for this humanitarian pause, the American media, the pro-Hamas Nazi American media, which even uses the so-called, not just the Palestinian health authorities, but the Red Crescent, which is under the Hamas rule, their numbers on injuries and so forth. You know, we have all these injuries. Oh, yeah, let's write that down and let's regurgitate it. Because our media, like the colleges and universities, like much of the Democrat Party, have thrown in with the Marxists and those who are promoting terrorism. Now, they'll say, that's awful to say. Well, what are they doing? I'll give you an example. Andrea Mitchell's been around a long time. She's a radical left-wing Democrat hack, always has been since her days as a cub reporter in Philadelphia, and she hasn't changed. Let's listen to this discussion a day or two ago with Andrea Mitchell and her guest. Go.
Are you concerned about frustration within the White House mounting really a pivot in the last couple of days because of the humanitarian crisis? The president has expressed it publicly and privately, as has Secretary Blinken.
First of all, we welcome the very solid support that we've received from President Biden.
See, they have to say this, or they won't get the arms. You know, there was a period when Obama was president, the Israelis were attacked. For 24 to 48 hours, he withheld support for Israel. And at the very end of his presidency, after Trump had already won in December, really the 11th hour of his presidency, he encouraged the Qataris to propose the most anti-Israel resolution that the UN has ever proposed. And we didn't oppose it. And then John Kerry, the Secretary of State, comes out and says, listen to this, you cannot have a Jewish state and democracy. Those are the words of an anti-Semite. What do you mean you can't have a Jewish state and a democracy? Do they go around saying you can't have a Muslim state and democracy, you can't have a Christian state and democracy? Who talks like this except against Israel? So she starts out by saying the president has said publicly and privately, so she's Biden's mouthpiece. MSNBC is the worst. They're all horrific. But it's the worst. It has Hamas Nazi-supporting hosts. It has racist, bigot anti-Semites like Joy Reid. It has fundamentally stupid people like the Scarboroughs who promote the propaganda and ought to resign as a matter of principle. I can tell you now, if Fox was pushing this, I'd be out of there in 2 seconds. 2 seconds. You didn't have to think about it. And they have hosts on that program, on that network, who make excuses for Hamas and keep talking about Israel didn't bother anybody. Their people were slaughtered in heinous, horrific, just evil ways. And they want to defend themselves, and they're going to defend themselves. Go ahead.
His moral clarity and material support as well in explaining that Israel is dealing with a terror organization that is worse than ISIS, and the U.S. will make sure Israel has everything it needs to win this war. And that's our starting point. Now, as for the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, we want to see humanitarian aid reach the people.
They want to see, slow down, let's hit this. All of a sudden, we're considered about humanitarian aid. Tell me, when Biden allowed $70 billion to flow into the Islamo-Nazi regime in Tehran, was he concerned about humanitarian aid? Was he concerned where that money went? How about his violations of the Taylor Force Act, which stops the provision of our tax dollars to the Palestinian Authority unless they stop killing people, which they refused to do, so Trump cut it off. Trump cut off Iran. Same with Hamas and Hezbollah. Talk about humanitarian aid. The Arab countries won't even take any of these Palestinians. Jordan sure as hell won't, because the Hashemite kingdom was almost overthrown. The kingdom. 3 monarchs that were set up by the Ottoman Empire in the late 1920s. That's how long Jordan's been around. It was called Transjordan. 1948, when they're attacking Israel to try and prevent Israel from existing, they grabbed Judea and Samaria and they call it the West Bank. And now everyone, oh, it's the West Bank, because they don't want to admit it's Judea and Samaria. And by the way, these short history lessons I watch, as if Israel began in 1948. No, Israel began 4,000 years ago. It is the return of the Jewish state, not the establishment of Jews in the neighborhood, taking the poor Palestinian lands away. First of all, there were no Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. There were Egyptians and Jews. But there were never Palestinians. There were Bedouins all over the world. There were never there were never human beings called Palestinians until Yasser Arafat had a clever idea. We're Arabs, let's call ourselves Palestinians, then we can draw a connection to the Bible. They were never Palestinians. Palestinians were the Jews. Kind of in a strange way, reminds me, the Federalists called themselves the Federalists because that was a very popular title, but they were actually the Anti-Federalists. But that's neither here nor there. Go ahead.
Of Gaza through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. And of course, we're discussing with international partners ways to step up humanitarian aid. We have
So here they are in the middle of a war for their survival. And they have to explain to Andrea Mitchell on MSNBC the provision of quote-unquote humanitarian aid. Now, I have a survey that was sent to me yesterday. It's pretty well sourced. That 70% of the Palestinians, that would be whether they're in the Gaza Strip, whether they're in other parts of the so-called Palestinian Authority territories, supported what Hamas did. 70%. And I thought Hamas was different than most Palestinians. 70%. Sounds like a big number to me. We have liberals in this country saying that Netanyahu ought to resign because 80%, he's unpopular with 80% of the people. Well, he is in the middle of a war, you know. But that said, how come they don't mention that 70% of the Palestinians support what Hamas has done and is doing? Humanitarian aid. We didn't give it to the Japanese during World War II. We didn't give it to the Germans or the Italians. We didn't give it to the Confederates or the citizens of the South when we were going through one city after another. You know, I haven't even talked about General Sherman and what he did with Atlanta in Georgia. They burned Atlanta to the ground. They didn't give a damn about the citizens. They wanted to end the war, and they did. Go.
One condition, which is our right and duty under international law, and that's to make sure that resources not reach Hamas, that Hamas, which perpetrated the October 7th massacre, not exploit those humanitarian corridors in order to rearm. Now, here's an example. You mentioned the question of fuel. We know, for example, that Hamas, the governing body in the Gaza Strip, has stockpiled 500,000 liters of fuel, 130,000 gallons. Now, what can you do with 500,000 liters of fuel? That's enough to circumnavigate the globe in a Boeing 747, just to give you an impression of how much fuel Hamas has stockpiled. Now, we have an obligation to protect our citizens, and we have an obligation to make sure that the fuel not reach Hamas. What's the problem? Hamas controls the distribution of resources inside the Gaza Strip. Hamas also decides when to steal.
In other words, they don't have the foggiest idea who's going to get this fuel, the food, the medicines, anything. Look at it this way. What happened to $150 billion in COVID money? Remember that? That's in the United States. It's our money. It stays within our borders. $150 billion through scammers and abuse and criminality and bureaucratic incompetence at the state, local, and federal level. We can't find $150 billion. That's a lot of damn money. We don't know where it went. But somehow, the Israelis are able to find out that the fuel and the food and the medicine they send into Gaza is going to go to the people as opposed to the terrorists. It's impossible. And yet Andrea Mitchell, such a moron, such a fraud, so predictable, What are you going to do? You know, President Biden, he's getting quite annoyed by all this. Screw Biden!
Want to see more Mark Levin? Go to LevinTV.com and subscribe now.